The water levels in this river in Pahang State, Malaysia, may have gone down, but the destruction caused by the floods is evident. Water overflowed onto highways, making some roads impassable for days. Pahang is the worst-hit state, with around 40,000 people displaced. Some towns are still cut off, accessible only by boat. But in some areas, floodwaters have begun to recede, and people are starting to return to their homes to count the cost of the damage, to rebuild their lives.
Of course I'm disappointed. The government hasn't helped us. I'm relying on friends. What else can I do?
Water rose quickly and unexpectedly, leaving many with barely enough time to save themselves, much less salvage their belongings.
The damage is extensive. Vehicles have to be written off. Furniture, appliances thrown away. People here estimate it'll take 2 weeks to clean their homes. And that task has been made more difficult because water and electricity supply haven't been restored.
Non-governmental organizations, charities and volunteers have been turning up to distribute aid. A plantation nearby has sent its workers and tractors to help with the cleanup.
We're from this area ourselves. We know the people here. They're like our brothers and sisters. That's why we had to help. If we don't, who will?
The relief centers are full. Some say they're worried about the risk of contracting COVID-19, but there's nowhere else to go. Ainatul Jannah, 4 months pregnant with her second child, says she's grateful they got out alive.
Water rose to chest level. I was really scared because that's never happened before. I messaged my family to ask them to get help to me, but they said emergency rescuers had been deployed to places that were even more badly affected.
Officials have warned there could be more flooding in the coming weeks, with the monsoon season set to run through to February.
Their homes bombed, displaced in their own countries, and now these Syrians must endure floods.
We've been cold for 4 days now. The heaters aren't working and the tents are leaking water in. Our situation is miserable. We've been displaced for 3 years and have no idea whether we will return or not. People have lost hope to return home.
It's not just the water they have to contend with. Temperatures in winter can drop below zero. Their struggle is to stay warm as well as dry.
Every morning I wake up and find that my children aren't near me. They go out early to collect scraps of plastic from the streets, such as bags and shoe soles, whatever they can find to feed the furnace here at UMRAID's, which we can use to keep warm and cook our meals.
But what the children collect to burn is bad for their lungs.
I can't afford a boiler and fuel is expensive. We need fire to do everything. I can't feed them because I don't have an oven. The winter is very hard.
Welcomed home, at least there is something to keep them warm.
We don't get any aid or anything, and that's our situation. It gets crowded with around 15 people crammed in one tent, where they eat and drink and sit.
But some are beginning to feel the effects on their health.
The smell is strong and there is a lot of smoke. Yesterday my chest started hurting and I wanted to go to see a doctor, but I couldn't afford it.
As the adults try to repair the damage done by floods, the children, who have known nothing else except this camp, try to make the most of what they have.
In Bolivia, workers on a raft with a heavy machine caught in a swirling sea of mud and floodwater. The sheer force of the Pairai River was too strong. The two were swept away, leaving the bulk of metal tossed around like a paperboat until it disappeared.
After trying to save their heavy machinery, they got trapped by floodwaters and were swept away.
Bolivia is in the middle of its rainy season. Floods are not uncommon, and so is the misery.
We have been stuck here since early morning because of rising river water.
As rivers rise, homes, roads and farmland are destroyed, and several people are missing. Rescue workers are trying to reach them. But more rain is expected in the coming days, with warnings that water levels may rise even further.
5 months ago, Tobias Schott left his business as an events organizer to help victims of the floods. He wanted to ensure those literally left in the cold after floods damaged their homes didn't have to stay that way for too long. With his team of volunteers, he started to collect air conditioners that can be used as heaters as well. With temperatures dropping below zero and her ground floor destroyed, Tanja Koningshoven has been camping in her bedroom.
All we have is this room. We sleep here, we cook here, everything happens here.
Downstairs, the situation has not changed since the night in July when she and her 3 children had to escape from the water. She has no insurance and the government's offer of help has yet to be seen.
There are days when you think things are going well and it's moving forward, but then something happens and you have these days when you just fall apart. Then everything comes back, and living in this construction site, we're freezing and it's always there.
The Ahr Valley in the western part of Germany was hit by floods after days of torrential rains. Almost 200 people were killed.
For survivors of the floods, winter has not only brought darkness and cold, but it also has revived their traumatic memories. While thousands of volunteers have helped them to cope so far, due to a lack of government support, many here feel 5 months on, they've been forgotten.
Living 2,500 meters above sea level, there are no grocery stores nearby. Farzana's day begins with getting milk for her family. She lives in the idyllic Pasu village, where 3 glaciers meet in northern Pakistan. But under the serene calm is an ever-present danger, because those glaciers are melting, and at different rates. Because of land erosion and floods, her house is now only 12 meters away from a riverbank. Farzana's family lives in constant fear, not knowing whether another flood will sweep it all away.
This used to be our agricultural land. When I was a child, we had fruit orchards and fields. After massive glacial outflows became more frequent, it's all become part of the river. The whole area in the summer is submerged. We face constant danger. Our village has lost cattle and lots of agricultural land, and this area has become more dangerous.
7 million people are at risk from glacial lake outburst floods, or GLOFs as they're locally known. Out of the 3,000 or more glacial lakes in northern Pakistan, the United Nations Development Programme says 33 are dangerous. More than 600 acres of arable land have been lost to the river, and many people living in Pasu are angry at the government for not doing enough. They say the talk about warning systems and protection walls never leads to action. The government maintains it's working with international partners to invest $40 million into saving lives and property.
These glaciers don't just affect the 7 million people, they affect the 230 million people who live in Pakistan. We have a project which is looking at setting up early warning systems so that we can at least get humans out of harm's way. But the challenge is the infrastructure. The infrastructure gets damaged. 70% of the damage caused by these glacial bursts is on infrastructure, and that creates an economic cost for Pakistan.
Scientists are assessing glacial fluctuations to understand the complex interactions involving climate and glacier response for its far-reaching impact on global weather. Pakistan's 7,000 plus known glaciers make it home to more glacial ice than anywhere on Earth outside the polar regions. And within the Himalayan region, alpine glaciers are sensitive to climatic changes due to their variable altitude and debris covering the ice. On the foothills of the Himalayan mountain range, there is erratic weather. Excessive rains cause flood, and a lack of rain means that waterways and springs such as this have dried up, and there's very little snow on the mountain tops. And that puts most of the population at risk, as more than 80% of Pakistan's fresh water comes from its glaciers.
This is a huge challenge for Pakistan. It's not of our own making. It's not because of Pakistan's emissions. It's because of what is happening around the world.
Surigao City. What was once a thriving community in the southern Philippines, now reduced to this. Everywhere we go, there is destruction. This police station was no match for Typhoon Rai's fury. Even the local hospital has not been spared. Tessie Leonardo walked for miles, desperate for drinking water. I asked about her family. She says her home was damaged and she had to leave her children behind. Romeo Bernales too feels frustrated.
We are like children abandoned by their parents. What happened to the government? Please don't forget us. Please help us.
Many survivors say they are now forced to scavenge for food. Are we also not human? They ask me, and wonder why help has not arrived. A few hundreds of meters away, Surigao Airport. Despite the damage, the airstrip is still operational. And from here, military reconnaissance flights and aid operations take off. From above, it is clear that Typhoon Rai spared no one. But we need to be on the ground to see how bad it is. So we take a boat and dock on Dinagat Island. Even for a country often battered by natural disasters, the magnitude of the destruction is unprecedented. In San Jose, there is hunger and heartbreak. UNICEF also says close to more than 800,000 children are in need of emergency assistance. Street by street, despair. Survivors say it feels like a struggle even to stay alive, while there are those who are still too shocked to share their ordeal. One woman approached me and asked if they had been forgotten.
Tulungan mo kami.
Please, please help us. It's Christmas, she tells us. But what we are seeing is just a fraction of the devastation. At least 4 other provinces are.
Chinese authorities have imposed their most severe lockdown in almost a year. 13 million people living in the northern city of Xi'an have been ordered to stay home from midnight on Thursday. Only one member of each household is allowed out to get food every 2 days, and only certified essential workers can head out for work. The measures prompted crowds to rush to grocery stores and markets earlier this week. More than 200 cases have been reported in the city since the beginning of the month. The outbreak of the Delta variant began with just 9 people and quickly spread.
The trajectories of the 9 cases were complex, involving transportation services and public places, including hospitals, commercial complexes, restaurants, and schools.
Hundreds of thousands of tourists flock to Xi'an, a former capital and historic hub, to see the terracotta warriors every year. Now, almost all transport in and out of the area has been cancelled. Residents must apply for special permission to leave the city. Authorities are currently conducting their 3rd round of mass testing. So far, no cases of the Omicron variant have been locally transmitted in China, but officials here are on high alert. The Beijing Winter Olympics opens in February, and Chinese leaders have promised a safe and secure games where spectators will be able to attend. Overseas spectators, however, won't be attending. China has maintained its zero-tolerance approach to the virus, and borders have been closed since March last year.
During the Winter Olympics, there will be a large number of Olympic-affiliated individuals from different countries and regions coming to China. There is a high possibility that a certain number of COVID-19 positive cases will arise.
More than 80% of the country's population have received 2 doses of coronavirus vaccines. Officials are now encouraging people to get a 3rd shot. But some studies have found that Chinese vaccines have lower efficacy and protection rates against the Omicron strain.
Omicron has gripped the United States. 73% of new cases are now attributed to that highly contagious variant. Testing sites across the U.S. are packed. In Cleveland, this new drive-up testing site was at capacity just hours after opening.
While COVID has been a tough adversary, we've shown that we're tougher.
To combat the Omicron surge, U.S. President Joe Biden on Tuesday announced 500 million home rapid tests will be distributed to Americans starting in January. Until now, U.S. rapid tests have been expensive and hard to find.
We're taking even more steps to make it easier to get tested and get tested for free.
Biden's also utilizing the Defense Production Act to ramp up test manufacturing for clinical use. He's deploying 1,000 troops to support overwhelmed doctors and nurses. And he's tapping into America's national stockpile of ventilators to ensure hospitals are well equipped. Still, Biden says the best way to prevent severe disease and death is vaccination.
All these people who have not been vaccinated, you have an obligation to yourselves, to your families, and quite frankly, I know I'll get criticized for this, to your country.
Shortly after taking office, Biden reversed his predecessor's withdrawal from the World Health Organization to unify the global fight against COVID. On Tuesday, Secretary of State Blinken announced an additional $580 million would be sent to the WHO to set up programs to get the unvaccinated their first shot. But it may already be too late.
We are going to be far behind what is needed for the OMICRON surge. And that's because of how transmissible this variant is. This may be one of the fastest spreading pathogens in medicine that we've ever seen. So all of these efforts that they announced today are excellent, but my concern is that they're not going to be rolled out fast enough.
The surge of the Omicron variant is disrupting the struggling U.S. economy. Sports leagues are canceling games. So are some Broadway shows. But Biden says it doesn't have to be this way. He pleaded with those skeptical of vaccines and government to reconsider.
My administration has put them in place not to control your life, but to save your life.
You might get some side effects. How did you react after you...
It may be Christmas, but the UK's vaccine booster programme rolls on without a pause. This is Portsmouth on England's south coast, and jabs are being given to people who've slipped between the cracks.
And we know that there are lots of people in Portsmouth that are not vaccinated, and we need to get the town vaccinated to be able to get over Omicron and get back to whatever normal is. But particularly the homeless, they're very vulnerable at this time of year. The cold, they sleep rough, and they definitely need to be protected from this Omicron virus.
Despite Christmas Day, the 25th, and Boxing Day, the 26th, being holidays, jabs are still being given. It's just this sort of public service that Boris Johnson thanked health workers and carers for in his Christmas message.
All those in the NHS working over Christmas, our care workers, everyone involved in the incredible vaccination campaign, those looking after people who have lost loved ones this year and who would otherwise be on their own.
He said, in so many words, those getting vaccinated and boosted are doing what Jesus would have wanted.
Getting jabbed, not just for themselves, for ourselves, but for friends and family and everyone we meet. And that, after all, is the teaching of Jesus Christ, whose birth is at the heart of this enormous festival.
Across Europe, Omicron is rampant, but countries are responding differently. Germans queue outside shops to show their health passes, nightclubs will be shut after Christmas, and major events will have attendance limits. Spain has brought back mandatory mask wearing outside now as well as inside. But the Netherlands lockdown is still something of an outlier. Non-essential shops, restaurants, hairdressers, gyms, museums and other public places are closed until at least the middle of January. Another Christmas in the shadow of COVID-19.
Health officials and journalists watched as more than 1 million doses of expired AstraZeneca vaccine were crushed. The destroyed vaccines were part of a massive shipment of more than 2 million doses received in October, a donation from developed nations. By November, many of them had expired before being put into people's arms. The government was keen to show people that no expired vaccines would be given out in a bid to boost confidence in the vaccine program.
Some tense moments at Windsor Castle today as Queen Elizabeth and some members of the royal family celebrated Christmas. British police arrested an armed man on the grounds. Authorities say he did not enter any buildings. Elsewhere, Pope Francis prayed for an end to the pandemic and called for dialogue to resolve the world's conflicts during his Christmas Day message from St. Peter's Square. Roxana Saberi reports from London.
In his annual Christmas address, Pope Francis urged the world to work together at a time when COVID is keeping so many people apart. He spoke before a few thousand masked worshippers, far more than last year when the pandemic forced him to speak indoors, far fewer than pre-pandemic levels. The faithful also gathered in Bethlehem, but in limited numbers, with Israel's borders shut to most international travelers. Some people mark the holiday with a booster.
Congratulations for having you.
there is still a wonderful thing you can give your family and the whole country, and that is to get that jab.
The royal family canceled its traditional Christmas Day church visit, while Queen Elizabeth stayed home at Windsor Castle.
Christmas can be hard for those who have lost loved ones.
Where she gave her first Christmas address since the death of her longtime husband, Prince Philip, in April.
For me and my family, even with one familiar laugh missing this year, there will be joy in Christmas.
It's only 10,000 troops that returned to their bases, and those were troops who were on temporary maneuvers. And the rest of 100,000 troops that were out and about from their normal bases in the Far East, all across Russia's many time zones, are still in the regional. They're in the area. They're still deployed in Crimea. They're still deployed in the south of Belarus, because there are Russian troops there now, and they're still deployed on 3 borders along the Ukrainian border. So, the fact that those 10,000 that were on temporary maneuvers next to the Ukrainian border went home doesn't really change anything in the grand scheme of things. It's still a very tense moment.
Well, combined with, you say it's a very slight de-escalation, but combined with Putin's comments a few days ago saying Russia wanted to avoid conflict, although it was accompanied with other more sort of aggressive statements. So obviously the situation remains very tense there on the border.
Yes, those speeches that President Putin gave over the last couple of days were aggressive. They were extremely emotional, in the sense that he looked like he could barely suppress his emotions, unless I've told people before, maybe he's just a very good actor, but actually he looked very angry, and he looked like he was humiliated, and he looked like he really believed that imminent invasion was incoming, and that NATO was an existential threat to Russia and Russian security and Russian sovereignty. He was really angry during those speeches that he gave, including one a day and a half ago to the Russian population in his annual speech, where he goes on for 4 or 5 hours and he takes random questions from people all over Russia.
When the USSR collapsed, Sergei Krikalev was floating inside the Mir space station some 350 kilometers above his home country. Initially, his mission was planned to last for 5 months. He eventually spent twice that time in orbit.
At the time, they had to reduce Soyuz launches drastically, and they also absolutely had to keep someone on board the Mir station for maintenance, so they eventually asked Krikalev to stay on.
In Russia, Krikalev is presented as a true Soviet hero who saved Mir. In the West, he is pictured abandoned in space by a crumbling superpower.
Ouf, c'est ce qu'a dû se dire ce matin Sergei Krikalev, le cosmonaute soviétique qui rongeait son frein dans l'espace depuis près d'1 an. La relève est enfin sur orbite, Krikalev est parti soviétique, il rentre russe.
It became big because it was a good story. A poor cosmonaut stuck up there, lost in space. But I happen to know Krikalev very well, and I can tell you he is very resilient. And he fully accepted this mission. It was not a problem.
When Sergei Krikalev returns to Earth on the 25th of March 1992, his country has essentially ceased to exist. His Soviet passport is worthless. He touches down in a Soyuz module just like this one in Kazakhstan, a now independent country. His home city has switched names back to St. Petersburg after being known as Leningrad for decades. And his comfortable monthly 600 ruble salary is now worth next to nothing. When it inherited the Soviet space program, Russia was broke.
They had a money problem. All of a sudden, the budget was gone. When Boris Yeltsin took power, any money spent on Russia's image and status in the world was considered wasted. And the space program was one of the main Soviet propaganda instruments, so it was clearly in the crosshairs. The situation was dire.
Soviet know-how was at risk, and Western powers decided to step in with a massive project, the International Space Station. The space race was over. It was time to cooperate.
The Americans invited the Russians to take part in the program. They came with all their space station expertise. They were the ones who started investing massively in space stations as soon as the early 70s.
At the beginning, it was difficult to work together, especially around 1995-96. After that, things eased up significantly with the first ISS missions.
On the 31st of October 2000, the first astronauts entered the ISS. Russian Soyuz and US shuttles started ferrying astronauts to and from the orbital station for 11 years until the shuttle program was abandoned, considered too expensive and too dangerous. From 2011, the Russians find themselves with a de facto monopoly on human spaceflight to the ISS. Seats cost up to 70 million euros. There are 4 capsules a year with 3 astronauts on board, enough to keep the program afloat. Until 2020, when a new competitor enters the arena, SpaceX with Crew Dragon.
Ignition and liftoff of the Falcon 9 to the space station on the first commercial launch from Kennedy Space Center's historic Pad 39A.
The Americans wanted direct access to space and the ISS. Until then, the US depended on Russia to access the ISS.
This is Houston. Bob and Doug, welcome to the International Space Station.
Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, is now faced with new competition from the US private sector and actors such as China or India. At 2 billion euros, its budget is 1/10 of NASA's. Not enough to start a new big project or even to take a significant part in the US-led push to build the Lunar Gateway, a space station orbiting the moon.
The Russian space agency sees itself as rejected and marginalized by the West. That fuels a nationalist feeling and a desire to develop ties with China. This is also happening in other sectors where China and Russia join forces.
What happens in space is deeply intertwined with geopolitics. It's very complex and important. The Russians are keeping all possibilities open. They can choose to cooperate with the Chinese, with the Americans, or with both.
For now, Russia has to scale back scientific and civilian operations, but it remains focused on its military program. On the 15th of November, it destroyed an old Soviet-era satellite with a missile fired from Earth. This isn't a first, but it still sends out a strong message.
It was clearly a show of force, a technological feat that demonstrated that Russia is to be taken seriously. It's also a way of appearing center stage at a time when everyone has eyes on China. Obviously, it doesn't make Russia look good, but it does show the world they're good at what they do.
Today, most smart weapons depend on satellites to operate. If a war breaks out, the Earth's orbit will become a major battleground. The Russians know this and are eager to show they're ready.
In this dramatization of a potential dystopian future, technology watchdog group, the Future of Life Institute, portrays killer autonomous weapons, using facial recognition technology and artificial intelligence to commit crimes, attack military and civilian targets, and spread terror, all without direct human involvement. It's not science fiction, technology experts say.
So you can actually create a drone that you say, just go hunt this specific individual and kill them remotely. And I think it's an extremely dangerous situation to be in.
Facial recognition technology, or FRT, doesn't require billions of dollars or dozens of supercomputers.
We're talking about being able to do something with commodity hardware with freely available tools. That stuff has been around for, a few years now. And there's no reason why that couldn't be used by folks, even, who don't have deep technical expertise.
The prospect of non-state actors employing the technology is troubling, but countries are already using mass surveillance FRT. In the U.S., police used FRT to identify specific Black Lives Matter protesters, then scrutinize their social media accounts and check for outstanding warrants. Other countries have massive networks of interconnected cameras.
London is a city that comes to mind. It's one of the most, it has one of the widest networks for surveillance, and they have processes in place to manage some of that.
China uses FRT to curtail human rights.
In China, there are specific ways in which they're trying to recognize the Uyghur minority so that they can, again, surveil and curtail their movements and harass them and put them in concentration camps and so on.
There are also positive, life-saving applications of the technology, for example, in auto safety.
Most people may not realize, but many new automobiles now have a camera that's built into the car that actually is observing the driver. And those sorts of technologies can be used then to help, recognize if somebody's getting drowsy or, is too impaired to drive and those sorts of things.
Like many technologies that have burgeoned in recent decades, FRT is largely unregulated. In September, a United Nations report singled out AI-enabled FRT as posing special threats to human rights. The UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, called on member states to issue an immediate moratorium on artificial systems until researchers fully assess what she called the catastrophic risks they pose.